Chapter 15, the digestive system, and Chapter 14, nutrition. And this is my first set of slides that includes two chapters, and I realize that you would think that we'd do Chapter 14 before Chapter 15, but I think it's important to see how the digestive system works before we learn what we ought to be putting into it. Here are the primary objectives for this module, and there's a lot of them just because we're looking at two chapters this time. And I'm not going to read these to you, but I'll stop for a second so that you can pause the video and read them to yourself if you want. Okay. Section 15.1, Digestion begins in the oral cavity. So the digestive system is actually made up of two major parts, and these parts include the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract, and a set of accessory organs, which include the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder. The GI tract begins at the oral cavity, or mouth, and winds through the abdominal cavity, and finally ends at the anus. The digestive system actually carries out 5 basic processes. Ingestion, which is when foods and liquids are taken into the mouth or eaten. Mixing, which is where the smooth muscle, in the walls of the GI tract mix the food together and send this mixture on its way through the tract. Digestion, which is where food is broken down either by mechanical or chemical processes, and we're going to go into both of these processes in great detail. There's absorption, which is where the epithelial cells lining the GI tract absorb the digestive food molecules and pass them on to the blood or lymph, and we'll talk about this whole process. And absorption mostly takes place within the small intestine. And then finally we have defecation, where any substance is not digested or absorbed is passed along to the end of the GI tract and out the anus such that it leaves the body. Here's a diagram which summarizes the organs which make up the digestive system. Both the organs which are part of the GI tract and those that are accessory organs. The organs which are part of the GI tract are in black letters, and accessory organs are in red letters. Now we're going to talk about the GI tract, which has a structure that remains the same throughout the full length of the GI tract. And you can think of the GI tract as just a series, or rather just one continuous tube that runs straight through the body with the various organs composing different sections of that tube. And the structure of the GI tract has 4 layers, or rather all the organs of the GI tract have 4 layers, and these layers are the mucosa, which is the innermost layer, and this is composed of a mucous membrane which allows the ingested food to move along the tract without tearing the tract, because the mucus basically acts as a lubricant for the food as it moves through the digestive system. There's the submucosa, which includes the glands, nerves, and blood supply for the tract itself. There's the muscularis, which is the muscular layer of the tract which gives it the ability to move substances lengthwise along the tube, and this is composed of a layer of longitudinal muscle which moves, or rather is arranged lengthwise, and this layer is above another layer of circular muscle which helps to squeeze the food, or rather the ingested substance, through the digestive system. And then finally there's the serosa, which is the outermost layer, and this is composed of a slippery membrane that permits the tract to move inside against itself and against the abdominal cavity without causing parts of the digestive organs to get caught or to cause discomfort within the abdominal cavity. Now, the reason that food moves along the digestive tract is that the muscular layer within the tract creates these contractions, which are called peristaltic waves. And this is a rhythmic muscular contraction of the tube, which forces the contents toward the open end of the tube. And the layers of the muscularis work in unison to propel the food through the digestive system. So here on your left is a diagram which shows the 4 layers of the GI tract. And as you can see, the mucosa is the innermost layer, which forms the lumen or hollow part of the tract. And then this is surrounded by the submucosa, which is made up of blood vessels and nerves mostly. And this is surrounded by the muscularis, which is composed of both longitudinal and circular muscle. And then finally, the outer layer is called the serosa. And then at your right is a diagram which shows how a peristaltic wave works. So here, when the food's in the esophagus, we have a peristaltic contraction which moves the food, or bolus as it's called in this case, down the tube towards the open end such that it drops into the stomach. In humans and most other mammals, digestion starts in the mouth, unless you're a spider or something, in which case they might excrete a digestive enzyme onto the food before they eat it. But anyway, we're going to talk about the teeth first. Adults have 32 of these permanent teeth, and these include the incisors, the canines, the molars, and the premolars. And we're not going to really go into the teeth too much, but anyway, it is important to keep the teeth clean because bacterial wastes are usually acidic, and if the acid remains on tooth surfaces, it can eat through the enamel to soften dentine at the center of the tooth. Now, plaque is a combination of the bacterial colonies, their bacterial waste, and also leftover sugars from chewed up food, also epithelial cells from the mouth of the host, and saliva. And obviously, sometimes we ingest foods that have bacteria on them, and there's also natural bacteria that occur in the mouth, and these would be the types of bacteria we're talking about here. And if we don't remove this plaque through brushing, we might develop a cavity, which does not cause pain at first, but as the acids produced by the bacteria reaches farther into the tooth, they eventually hit the softer tissue near the tooth's nerve called the pulp, and this of course leads to pain. Now, the tongue is an accessory organ of the digestive system, and its job is to manipulate food into a ball called a bolus, which is then positioned by the tongue at the back of the oral cavity so that we can swallow it. The tongue is also responsible for secreting a digestive enzyme called lingual lipase from the sublingual salivary glands on the undersurface of the tongue. The mouth is primarily responsible for mechanical digestion, which is the physical crushing and grinding up of the food. And the reason we do this is that we want to increase the efficiency of the enzymes in the stomach and small intestine by creating small bits of food with a large surface area, which is obtained when they're ground up. And this allows the enzymes to carry out the process of chemical digestion, where the enzymes actually help to break down the chemical bonds within the various molecules found in food. Here's an anterior view of the mouth, and you can clearly see how all of the teeth are arranged in the mouth. And you can also see where the uvula and tonsils are positioned. And we're going to talk about these two structures in a moment. No matter how much we wash or cook food, there's really no way to completely prevent microbes from entering the mouth. So the digestive system has defenses to defend against these microbes that will enter our mouth by way of food. So our first line of defense against these microbes are the tonsils, which are located at the back of the oral cavity, and these swell in response to any pathogens that may enter the mouth through the specific action of the immune tissues. And tonsils are basically a kind of primitive lymph node, basically. And we'll talk more about what lymph nodes are later on when we cover immunity, so don't worry about this too much just yet. And then we have MALT, which is an acronym for mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And these are also lymph nodes, or rather nodules of lymphatic tissue, which work to prevent pathogens from taking over the lumen or hollow portion of the digestive tract. And these are obviously important for preserving homeostasis. MALT actually represents a large percentage of the entire immune system, including about 1/2 of the body's total lymphocytes and macrocytes. So if I didn't just go out and say it, lymph nodes are basically parts of the lymphatic system which contain a large concentration of lymphocytes and macrophages. Without MALT, pathogens could grow within the digestive tract and penetrate the epithelial lining, which could lead to a serious internal infection. However, MALT is very effective, so it's going to be pretty difficult to overrun the digestive tract. Now we're going to talk about the accessory organs of the digestive system, starting with the salivary glands. These are located within the oral cavity, and they secrete saliva in small quantities in order to moisten the oral mucosa. And even the thought of food can increase salivary, or rather saliva production, through the aid of certain digestive hormones. And we actually have two major salivary glands. There are the parotid glands, which are located below and in front of the ears within the oral cavity, and these produce a watery saliva which includes some ions in it. And then we have the submandibular glands near the tongue, and these produce a thicker, ropier saliva with a similar ion content, but with a larger concentration of mucus, which makes it thicker. Saliva also contains lysozyme, which is a bacteriolytic enzyme which helps to destroy the bacteria in the oral cavity by interfering with their plasma membranes. And then another component of the saliva, or rather another enzyme, is salivary amylase, which is a digestive enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates into monosaccharides. So even within the mouth, we're already carrying out chemical digestion. And when the salivary glands become infected, the resulting disease is the mumps. Now we're going to talk about deglutition, or the process of swallowing food. And this occurs in stages. First, there's the voluntary stage, where you consciously swallow the food. In this stage, the tongue positions the bolus, or rather the ground up, balled up food at the opening of the esophagus, and at this point, we're at the last voluntary movement required for digestion. And after that, there's the pharyngeal stage, where the bolus passes through the pharynx. And in order to keep the food from accidentally going into the respiratory tract, which is positioned at the front of the throat, we have the cartilaginous epiglottis, which closes against the larynx to allow the food, or rather the bolus, to pass over the larynx, bypassing the respiratory system and allowing it to enter the esophagus of the digestive system. We also have the uvula, which is at the back of the throat and hangs down, which swings upward and closes the nasal passage between the mouth and nose. And also when we're swallowing, the larynx moves upward against the epiglottis, making it fold over the entrance to the trachea, such that we don't get food entering the respiratory system. In the case of the uvula, so we don't get food into the nasal cavity. This diagram shows the process of swallowing as it relates to the pharynx. So here in the voluntary stage, you can see that the tongue has positioned the bolus of food into the back of the throat. And then in the pharyngeal stage, the uvula swings up, the epiglottis moves down, and the food moves down into the esophagus, bypassing the respiratory system. The esophagus is simply just the tube which connects the oral cavity to the stomach. And this is a collapsible tube which is 20 to 25 centimeters long and is a conduit that connects the oral cavity with the stomach, like I said. And now we're going to talk about the third stage of swallowing, which is called the esophageal stage. And this is where food moves through the esophagus into the stomach via peristalsis. And there's really no free falling of food into the stomach because we use these peristaltic waves to just move the food down the esophagus so it can enter the stomach. The esophagus terminates at its lower end with the sphincter muscle, and a sphincter muscle is just a circular muscle that acts to close and open the ends of tubes. And we have these sphincters throughout the digestive system, and they divide one organ from the next. And then finally we have, or rather, the specific sphincter that we're talking about here is the lower esophageal sphincter, which is at the base of the esophagus, and this opens when a bolus touches it. The esophagus actually runs right through the diaphragm at what's called the esophageal hiatus, and sometimes portions, or the uppermost portions of the stomach can protrude from this opening, resulting in a condition called, a hiatal hernia. Section 15.2, the stomach puts food to the acid test. And obviously the stomach must be pretty important to digestion, seeing as it has its own section. The stomach is a J-shaped organ that lies right beneath the esophagus, and it's separated from the esophagus by a sphincter muscle, and it's also separated from the small intestine by a sphincter muscle. The lower esophageal sphincter is it defines the upper boundary of the stomach, and then the sphincter which separates it from the small intestine is called the pyloric sphincter, located at the base of the stomach. And this is the strongest sphincter muscle of the digestive tract, and when it contracts, it can create projectile vomiting, or rather cause projectile vomiting. And it opens to allow chyme to enter the small intestine only when the small intestine is chemically ready. And we'll talk about how it becomes chemically ready here in a moment. The GI tract has some major modifications at the stomach. The stomach actually has a third layer of muscle within the muscularis called the oblique layer, which helps to churn and mix food with the stomach acid. In addition to this, the walls of the stomach have folds called rugae, and these are within the mucosa of the stomach, which help to permit the expansion of the stomach when we've put food into it. And when the stomach isn't full, these folds make it look somewhat like a deflated punching ball. And over here at the right, we have the diagram of the stomach, which shows the various parts of the stomach. And just remember that the fundus of the stomach is the topmost portion of the stomach. And then we have the body of the stomach. And then we have the pyloric section of the stomach, which isn't really mentioned here, but that's the bottom of the stomach near the pyloric sphincter. The acid secreted by the stomach has a pH of 2, which makes it so acidic that the stomach must be protected from this acid. And we need the stomach acid to have such a high acidity in order to break down the large macromolecules of the food we eat, and also to destroy the microbes that may have found their way into the stomach atop the food we've eaten. So this kind of means that the stomach acts as, or rather has somewhat of an immunity function within the body. In addition to the stomach acid, the stomach also secretes enzymes which digest proteins, and guess what? The stomach is made of proteins, so these enzymes are capable of digesting the stomach. So in order for the stomach to be protected from its own contents, it produces a very thick layer of viscous alkaline or anti-acidic mucus, which serves to protect it. Gastric pits are structures within the walls of the stomach which are responsible for secreting 2 to 3 quarts of gastric juice each day. And for those of you not familiar with the American measuring system, this would be 2 big gulps of gastric juice each day. And these pits are composed of 2 different kinds of cells, chief cells and parietal cells. The chief cells secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Pepsinogen is the inactive precursor of an enzyme called pepsin, which is capable of digesting the stomach as it's responsible for digesting proteins, and must be secreted in its inactive form. And this enzyme is activated only under a pH of 2, which means that it needs to come in contact with stomach acid before it's activated. And then we have gastric lipase, which as enzymes are classified, or rather they're named, with the ending A's and a beginning which corresponds to what they break down. Lipase breaks down fats. This enzyme specializes in digesting short-chain fatty acids specifically, such as those found in milk, but it works at an optimum pH of 5 or 6. The parietal cells are responsible for producing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid is responsible for the acidic pH of the stomach. I should say that it's a component of stomach acid, and this low pH is what activates the pepsin, kills microbes, and denatures or digests ingested proteins. And to denature means to cause the protein to lose its shape that it functions best at, such that we can cut it into smaller pieces in the instance of digestion. And then intrinsic factor is necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12, which is a micronutrient which aids in producing blood cells. And intrinsic factor is only active in the small intestine. Here's a picture of the gastric pits within the stomach. The stomach is a very active organ because it's involved in both mechanical and chemical digestion. When the bolus of food approaches the stomach initiates small mixing waves or peristaltic waves, and these waves occur every 15 seconds or so. And we have these waves to ensure that food mixes with the gastric secretions such that this mixture becomes very soupy and thin. And the food may stay in the fundus of the stomach for as long as 2 hours before being moved into the body of the stomach. Now, these mixing waves get stronger as we approach the pyloric sphincter, and a small portion of the chyme, and chyme is the mixture of food and gastric secretions, is forced through the pyloric sphincter and into the small intestine. The digestive process that the stomach carries out is called gastric digestion, and it occurs in 3 phases. First, there is the cephalic phase. which consists of reflexes initiated by the special senses. Scents and sounds associated with eating stimulate specific portions of the medulla oblongata of the brain, which in turn can trigger secretion of the gastric pits through the aid of hormones. And in the cephalic phase of digestion, the parasympathetic nervous system is activated so that we can increase stomach movement. Then the second phase is the gastric phase, which is initiated when the stretch receptors and chemoreceptors of the stomach are activated. In this phase, the stomach produces a chemical called gastrin, as well as continuing the production of pepsin to digest protein and HCl. And this gastrin is actually a hormone which aids in the stimulation of the gastric pits. Now, as the chyme or a stomach acid food mixture is pushed past the pyloric sphincter, this causes the stomach volume to decrease and the stretch receptors of the stomach to relax. And finally, in the intestinal phase, the chyme actually passes through the pyloric sphincter and the intestinal receptors of the small intestine are stimulated. The chyme then leaves the stomach and the gastric production decreases because we no longer need to be producing so many acids and enzymes in the stomach, and the brain begins to slow the stimulation of the gastric pits. And really here we're just kind of hitting the off switch of the gastric pits. And then these receptors stimulate the continued digestion of food in the small intestine. And yes, it seems kind of weird to be talking about digestion in the context of the small intestine, but a significant part of digestion actually takes place here. This diagram shows the phases of gastric digestion. The first one is the cephalic phase, which is mostly mediated by the brain. And in this phase, the brain produces hormones that travel to the stomach to stimulate the production of gastrin. And the stomach talks to the brain throughout this whole process, or rather maintains contact through the whole process. The stomach then produces gastrin in this gastric phase and some of its own hormones, which leads to the increased production of gastric secretions. And then finally, in the intestinal phase, which actually happens in the top portion of the small intestine, when the food activate these stretch receptors in the small intestine, the cells respond by producing hormones which result in the decreased production of gastric secretions. Now we're at the point where the chyme is leaving the stomach and entering the small intestine. And once the chyme gets into the small intestine, it stimulates the release of certain hormones. And these specific hormones that we're releasing are essentially released to ensure that the environment in the small intestine remains closer to neutral and not as acidic as the stomach, because there's a lot of enzymes that go to work on the chyme in the small intestine that work best in a more neutral environment. And the molecules which actually stimulate the release of these hormones are actually the glucose and fatty acids found in the chyme. And the two hormones that we're going to talk about specifically are cholecystokinin and secretin. And we're actually going to just look at 3 hormones throughout the whole digestive system, and you might want to write this down. These hormones are gastrin, cholecystokinin, and secretin. And cholecystokinin is going to be abbreviated to CCK, so I don't keep butchering the name. But anyway, this hormone is the one responsible for inhibiting stomach emptying at this point, because we've already got the chyme in the small intestine, and we don't want any more stomach acid getting into this area to acidify the small intestine. And then we also release secretin in the small intestine, which decreases the gastric secretions of the stomach. Essentially what we're doing right now is basically turning off the stomach because we're done with the stomach and we need to begin digestion in the small intestine. And what these hormones ultimately do is they ensure that the molecules within the chyme are sufficiently broken down so that they can be absorbed later on in the small intestine. Now, usually the stomach empties in 2 to 4 hours after eating. Foods with higher fat content generally remain in the stomach the longest, mostly because lipids are one of the hardest macromolecules to digest, whereas carbohydrates are much easier to digest. And this is the reason why you don't feel full for long after eating just vegetables, and you might feel full for quite a while after eating something really fatty. And this is obviously because vegetables contain mostly carbohydrates and a little protein, and yeah, that's the reason they take such little time to digest compared to other foods. Now we're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, vomiting. And vomiting is essentially caused by reversing the peristaltic wave. And the reason we vomit is related to what I said earlier, and that is that sometimes the food we eat may contain bacteria or toxins, and these are usually destroyed by the stomach acid. However, sometimes certain bacteria or toxins are not destroyed by the acid for some reason or another, and this leads to the irritation of the stomach lining through the interference of these bacteria or toxins, and this irritation is what leads to vomiting. So now we're going to talk about the physiological process of vomiting, or rather how vomiting is performed. So when we vomit, we reverse the peristaltic wave while the stomach is churning the chyme up violently at this point. And to actually vomit or push the food up into the esophagus, into the mouth, and then out of the mouth, we contract the pyloric sphincter. And remember, this is the sphincter at the bottom of the stomach. And it's so strong that when it contracts, it's capable of pushing all the contents, or rather most of the contents of the stomach, up the esophagus and out the mouth. Unfortunately, our esophagus and mouth aren't buffered from the acidity of the stomach, and this means that repeated vomiting can be detrimental to the lining of the mouth and esophagus because it's very damaging to these linings, and it can also cause the wearing away of the tooth enamel. So vomiting is actually pretty bad for your teeth, I suppose. Also, I forgot to say this in the next slide, but there is a buffer system that works at the beginning of the small intestine to ensure that we neutralize whatever stomach acid might have seeped into the small intestine. And this is what prevents the small intestine from being eaten, burnt, or otherwise destroyed by the stomach acid. Now, another thing about vomiting is that the act of vomiting causes us to lose a lot of the hydrogen ions from our body, because there's a lot of hydrogen ions in the stomach, I suppose. And through vomiting, we can eventually deplete the hydrogen content or concentration of the blood, which would lead to an electrolyte imbalance. So that's why it's important to maybe eat something else if we've vomited, and also to get some fluids is probably a good idea. I'm going to retract that last statement I made about vomiting. So obviously, if you vomited, you probably don't feel very well, and it's probably also not a great idea just to go eat after you've already thrown up. But at some point, you're going to have to replace those hydrogen ions that we've lost. Anyway, moving on to section 15.3. The intestines and accessory organs finish the job. And here in this chapter, we're going to talk about the process of absorption in the small intestine, as we've pretty much finished up with digestion. And in your book, it calls this absorption process that takes place in the small intestine, the nutrition extraction phase, which is a pretty accurate description, I would say. But anyway, we're going to talk about the parts of the small intestine before we move on to what it actually does. So the small intestine consists of three parts. First, there's the duodenum, which is the region connected directly to the stomach, and it's the shortest of all three regions, extending approximately 25 centimeters from the pyloric sphincter. And it's called the duodenum because the word duodenum means 12, and this is because the region is approximately 12 fingers long. Next is the jejunum, which encompasses the next 2 meters or 6 feet or so. Jejunum means empty because when an autopsy is performed on a body, this region is typically empty. Then finally there's the ileum, which is the longest portion, and it's about 3.5 meters long. The entire length of the small intestine is 6 to 7 meters, or about 20 feet, and this makes it the longest digestive organ in the body, and simply the longest organ in the body. The small intestine is packed into the abdominal cavity by twisting and winding around the central mesenteries, and these mesenteries are basically just clear connective tissues which connect parts of the small intestine to other parts of the small intestine so it doesn't get moved into a position that would be uncomfortable. Because the small intestine is our primary organ of absorption, it must have a large surface area so that it maintains an efficient rate of absorption. And the mucosa of the small intestine is shaped into permanent circular folds which increase the surface area. And like I said, the folds increase the absorption and also force the chyme to move in a spiral fashion, which increases the pathway that they take through the intestine, which allows for more time to absorb the nutrients. Now, another feature of the small intestine which aids in absorption is that the mucosa also is made up of many finger-like extensions called villi, which are approximately 0.5 to 1 millimeter long each. And villi are actually made of areolar connective tissue, which is located at the center of each. And this connective tissue supports an arteriole, a venule, and a blood capillary network connecting the two, and a lacteal, or this is a dead-ended lymphatic vessel within the villi. And now the villi actually have their own villi on them, and these are called microvilli, and these are essentially hair-like projections off of the villi. And these are found on each apical membrane of the small intestine mucosa, and these further increase the surface area of the small intestine. The entire surface area of the cells which make up the villi are called the brush border. So now that we have all these features which increase the surface area of the small intestine, the total surface area of the small intestine is actually about the size of a tennis court, which is 260 meters squared, and that is a lot of surface area to just be all bound up in your abdominal cavity. Here's a diagram of the structure of the villi in the small intestine. So at the top of this diagram you can see a cross section of the villi which shows the arteriole, the venule, and the lymphatic vessel. And we need the blood vessels to be in the small intestine so that we can absorb the nutrients directly into the blood, and then the blood can deliver the nutrients to the rest of the body cells. And also these lymphatic vessels are in the small intestine, not because we need some immunofunction in it, but rather because this is where the lipids are absorbed into the body in the lymph. And this is primarily related to the fact that lipids are pretty hard to digest, and we'll talk about how we might digest lipids here in a second. But anyway, the rest of the diagram, we just have basically a increasingly large or more up close view of the villi. So the first one just shows the mucosa of the small intestine so that we can see each of the individual villi. And then in the next picture, we're taking a closer look at the villi such that we can see all of the microvilli hanging off of it. And then we're going to take an even closer look so that we can see the brush border of the small intestine. The immune system is also active in the small intestine. The small intestine has an abundance of malt. And the immune structures in the small intestine are called Peyer's patches. And these are responsible for protecting the lumen of the small intestine from bacterial invasion. And these are essentially like tonsils in the mouth or just in the small intestine. And they're nodules of lymphatic tissue, just like the tonsils. And they prevent any surviving bacteria that made it through the stomach from causing serious problems in the small intestine. And we really need these Peyer's patches because the small intestine is very nutrient rich and it's also warm and moist, which would be a very good environment for bacteria to grow in if we didn't have these immune system measures, or if we didn't take these immune system measures. Okay, I kind of unintentionally lied to you again. We're still going to talk about digestion a little bit more in the small intestine. And both mechanical and chemical digestion occur in the small intestine. The mechanical part of this is the peristaltic wave, which is modified into segmentations and migrating motility complexes. Segmentations are localized mixing contractions, which swirl the chyme just in one section of the intestine, whereas migrating motility complexes are what move the chyme along the length of the small intestine. And these movements strengthen with the nutrient, well, rather they strengthen as the nutrient level in the chyme decreases. So segmentations cause swirling, and migrating motility complexes just push the chyme along the length of the small intestine. And like I said, there are several digestive enzymes in the small intestine, and these are responsible for chemical digestion in the small intestine. There's pancreatic juice, which is secreted from the pancreas, and this contains several different enzymes. And the pancreas adds this to the chyme as it enters the small intestine. And we'll talk more about the pancreas in a second. We also have these enzymes in the small intestine, sucrase, lactase, maltase, and also pancreatic amylase, which all digest carbohydrates. And you can tell what they digest from their names. So obviously, sucrase digests sucrose, lactase helps us break down lactose, and maltase helps us break down maltose. Trypsin, chemotrypsin, carboxypeptidase and elastase are also all secreted from the pancreas, and these are used to digest proteins. The pancreas also secretes lipase, which breaks down lipids, and this is the main enzyme which causes the breakdown of fats in adults, and it works by removing 2 of the 3 fatty acids from ingested triglycerides. In addition to those hormones which help to keep acid out of the small intestine and otherwise turn off the stomach, the small intestine also has pH buffers in the pancreatic juice, which help to bring the pH of the chyme from 2 back to 7 in the small intestine. And we need a pH of 7 in the small intestine to protect the walls of the small intestine, and also to allow the hormones of the small intestine, or rather, the enzymes of the small intestine to work in that 7 pH environment, because they don't work in an acidic environment. And these buffers also render pepsidase back into pepsin, which is it's an active form, and this is because we have other peptidases in the small intestine. So in the cells of the small intestine, carbohydrates, short-chain fatty acids, and amino acids are absorbed and transported to the capillaries or lacteal. And the reason the lipids pass into the lacteal is because the absorbed triglycerides are simply too large to pass directly into the bloodstream. And like I said, this is what makes them difficult to digest and absorb, or it's related to that. The fats are eventually converted to chylomicrons and then transported into the lymphatic capillary, which is the lacteal. The fats then flow with the lymph to the subclavian vein, and once the fats enter the bloodstream, lipoprotein lipase breaks down the chylomicrons to short-chain fatty acids and glycerol, which are going to be much easier for the cells of the body to take up. So here we have a diagram of the actual transport methods by which the small intestine absorbs lipids, proteins, and carbohydrates into either the intestinal capillaries or lacteals for lipids. So first we have the carbohydrates, and we have the carbohydrate fructose, which is absorbed through the brush border by facilitated diffusion, and then it also goes into the capillaries the capillaries through facilitated diffusion. And then we have here glucose and galactose, and they're first absorbed by the brush border through active transport, and then they're absorbed into the capillaries by facilitated diffusion. And then we have the proteins, which are first broken down into amino acids by enzymes, and then through the process of active transport are absorbed through the brush border, and then they just are absorbed into the capillaries by diffusion. And then finally we have the lipids or fats, which are the most difficult of these nutrients to digest. So we start with this large lipid droplet. We add bile salts to it from the gallbladder, and these bile salts break down the lipid into smaller droplets called micelles, and then these micelles are further broken down by the enzymes into fatty acids and monoglycerides, and these are absorbed into the or through the brush border, and they're brought into the lacteal through exocytosis, which is a form of active transport. So you can kind of see here why they're so difficult to digest and absorb, because it's just a whole thing with them. So what happens when the stomach acid eats through parts of digestive organs? Well, a hole called an ulcer is formed, and these are open wounds which remain aggravated and painful and don't really heal very fast. And there are at least two types of ulcers. There's gastric ulcers in the stomach, or duodenal ulcers in the small intestine. These occur when the mucus layer is worn away and the acidity in the lumen or hollow portion of the digestive system begins to burn the stomach or intestinal lining. This causes pepsin, or rather allows pepsin, to digest proteins of the stomach or intestinal wall, which creates a hole in that organ called an ulcer. And now we know that ulcers are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. They used to be blamed on stress mostly, but now we know that it's an actual bacteria. And this is a spiral-shaped bacterium that thrives in highly acidic environments, like that in the stomach. And the best way to get rid of ulcers, because they're caused by this bacteria, is to simply take antibiotics. Another thing that can cause ulcers is ingestion of alcohol or aspirin, and this can also lead to the degradation of the mucus lining, which eventually leads to an ulcer. Now I'm going to talk about 3 of the primary accessory organs of the digestive system, and these are found along the length of the digestive tract, and the ones we're going to talk about are the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. And in this diagram you can see these 3 organs, and here where it's showing a closer view of the pancreas, we're looking at the 2 types of cells within the pancreas, the acinar cells and the islet cells. We're going to start with the pancreas, which is essentially an enzyme factory. And the pancreas functions as an exocrine gland in the digestive system, which simply means that it excretes these enzymes. And like I said, the pancreas is made up of 2 types of cells. The cells of the islets of Langerhans, which sounds like a set of mystical islands, and then there's the acinar cells. And we're going to simply call the first cells the islet cells. And these function as endocrine cells because they secrete insulin and glucagon. And insulin is the hormone responsible for glucose uptake, and we'll talk about it in greater detail in a second, as it is involved with diabetes. And then there's glucagon, which causes glucose to be released into the bloodstream by those muscle and or liver cells sequestering it, so it kind of has the opposite effect on glucose than what insulin has. So now we're going to talk about the acinar cells, which produce digestive enzymes. And these enzymes that are produced here are released via a duct called the pancreatic duct. Almost all of the enzymes that act in the small intestine are actually made in the pancreas. And like I said before, it secretes pancreatic juice, which contains buffers to neutralize the acidity of the chyme, which has left the stomach. And we need these pancreatic juice buffers because the small intestine does not have the protective layer of mucus found in the stomach, which means that it has absolutely no protection other than these buffers from the corrosive pH 2 of the stomach acid. The pancreatic juice, like we said before, neutralizes the chyme, which I've spelled wrong here, such that it doesn't burn the duodenum. The liver is another accessory organ of the digestive system, and it has many functions. The main function the book wanted to focus on is that the liver detoxifies the bloodstream. But we're going to talk about a few more functions in addition to this. The liver is the largest organ of the body besides the skin, and I'm pretty sure it's the largest organ by weight, as it weighs 1,450 grams. Now the liver is divided into 2 lobes, kind of like how the lungs are divided into lobes, and it sits mostly on the right anterior side of the abdomen within the body. Now, these two lobes of the liver are made up of liver cells called hepatocytes, and these are arranged into units called lobules. And if you'll recall when we covered the cardiovascular system, I touched on portal systems just a little bit, but now we're going to look at the liver's portal system in more detail. Now, the veins of the small intestine drain into the liver, where they break into capillaries again before being collected into a larger vein and return to the heart. So you can think of portal systems as just a detour, or rather an alternative route, or maybe even a shortcut through the circulatory or cardiovascular system, And the reason there's this portal system in the liver is that it gives the individual hepatocytes access to the blood coming from the small intestines. And these hepatocytes are responsible for cleansing the blood, removing toxins such as what we would find in alcohol or some medications, and also legal and illegal drugs. The liver also stores excess minerals such as iron, and it also stores soluble vitamins such as A, D, and E. In addition to this, the liver cells manufacture cholesterol, plasma proteins, and the lipids in the blood. And the third function we're going to look at, or maybe it's not really the third function, but another function we're going to look at, is that the liver also monitors the glucose levels of the blood. When glucose levels exceed 0.1%, the hepatocytes remove and store the excess glucose as glycogen. When glucose levels drop, the stored glycogen is broken down into glucose and released into the bloodstream. So here's a diagram of a liver lobule, and I'm not going to have you worry too much about the structure of this. But anyway, if you look at the part of this diagram in the upper left, you can see the central vein which runs through this lobule, and then the hepatocytes over to either side or just around the vein. And this allows the blood to flow by the hepatocytes so they can cleanse it. And then over to your right is some more details of the various histological components of the liver. I wouldn't be too worried about this either. Just know that the hepatic vein feeds into the liver, and the hepatic artery leads out of the liver. And also, if you look at the upper right corner of this part of the diagram, you can see the bile duct in green, and we'll talk more about what that's for in a second, or rather on the next slide even. The last accessory organ we're going to talk about is the gallbladder, which stores and releases bile. Now, bile is formed by the liver as a byproduct of the breakdown of hemoglobin and cholesterol. So then we can say that the bile duct is just a means by which we send the bile from the liver to the gallbladder. And the bile is then stored in the gallbladder, which is under the right lobe of the liver. Bile is released from the gallbladder when fatty chyme is present in the duodenum of the small intestine. And these concentrated bile salts act as an emulsifier, or biological detergent, which breaks down the large lipid globules, or these droplets of fat, into smaller ones. And that's what emulsification is, and you might want to write that down. But it's when we break these large fat globules into smaller ones so that they can be transported into the lacteals within the small intestine. Bile acids and fat digestion, or rather bile aids fat digestion, by increasing the surface area on which the digestive activities of pancreatic lipase can act. And this is accomplished by breaking the large fat droplets into smaller ones, because when we do that we increase the surface area. Another thing about the gallbladder is that sometimes stones can form in the bile, and these are called gallstones. And gallstones are actually small condensed crystals of cholesterol which form in the gallbladder and may attract calcium ions from the concentrated bile, which results in the formation of a stone. And these stones can eventually grow big enough to get stuck in the bile duct, which of course causes pain and blocks the flow of bile. And for this reason, the gallbladder is often removed if stones are a problem, or rather are a chronic problem. And because the gallbladder only stores bile, it's still produced, it's just not stored. We just have to make more each time there's lipids in the duodenum of the small intestine. Now we're going to move back to the GI tract and talk about the large intestine, which absorbs and reabsorbs both water, vitamins, and minerals. And that's its primary function, is to reabsorb the water so we don't lose it when we defecate. We also need to reabsorb these dissolved minerals and vitamins because we'll need them for other processes. Now the ileocecal valve is what makes the transition from the ileum of the small intestine to the cecum of the large intestine. And the cecum in humans is not really functioning, so just take note of that. And then the ileum is the part of the small intestine which joins the large intestine just a few centimeters from the bottom of the large intestine. The cilium actually hangs below this junction, and this forms a blind pouch that ends in the vermiform appendix, and we'll just call this the appendix. And sometimes this will get compacted, leading to inflammation of the appendix or appendicitis, and the appendix is going to need to be removed before this causes a problem. But we don't really need it because the cecum doesn't really serve a purpose in humans, so we can just remove the appendix without any further complications. The rest of the large intestine after the cecum is called the colon. And there are 4 divisions of the colon, and these divisions don't have the technical names that the divisions of the small intestine do. But anyway, there's the ascending colon, which runs up the right side of the abdominal cavity, the transverse colon, which runs across the top of the abdominal cavity underneath the stomach, and the descending colon, which runs down the left side of the abdominal cavity. So the ascending colon runs up, the transverse colon runs across, and the descending colon runs down. The 4th and final division is called the sigmoid colon, and this is an S-shaped portion of the colon at the lower left of the abdominal cavity, and it's a horizontal running S. Feces may sit here for long periods of time before moving out of the rectum, and actually whatever you've eaten actually stays in the large intestine the longest for, I believe, about 18 hours on average. That might be the minimum time it spends in there, actually. The walls of the large intestine have haustra, which are pouches created by strands of muscle in the walls, and these are filled with undigested material or feces, which moves from pouch to pouch via mass movements. So we just have a bunch of material moving through here all at once. Now polyps are growth in the colon, which can develop as the feces rest against the mucosa, and sometimes these polyps can actually be cancerous and would be responsible for colon cancer. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we talk about cancer. So the last part, or rather the last 20 centimeters of the colon, are the rectum and anus. And I was wrong in the last slide because chyme only remains in the colon for 3 to 10 hours, and during this time it becomes progressively drier as the large intestine absorbs water, and this compacted chyme or undigested chyme is called feces. Feces enter the upper portion of the rectum, which triggers the opening of the internal anal sphincter, which is a smooth muscle, and it's just a sphincter muscle like any other sphincter muscle. The feces then move into the rectum and press against the external anal sphincter. And pressure is what triggers defecation. We use skeletal muscle action to accomplish this, such that it is voluntary, which means that we consciously have to make ourselves defecate. And on average, by age 2.5, children are mature enough to control their own defecation. And then we're going to talk about diarrhea, which is forced defecation, which results from irritation of the colon. And when we have diarrhea, the chyme moves through the colon so quickly that water or materials cannot be reabsorbed. So when we actually have diarrhea, we lose a lot of these minerals and fluids. So it's a good idea to drink a lot of fluids when you've had diarrhea. So like I said, material moves through the large intestine in mass movements, and these mass movements are created using a peristaltic wave, just like any other movement of material through the digestive system. And like I also said, the colon reabsorbs water, minerals, and vitamins and pulls them back into the bloodstream across the lining of the colon. And this removal of the water within the colon leaves undigested remains in the colon. And these undigested remains, or feces, are made up of undigested food and fiber. Now within the colon we have a lot of good natural bacteria that reside there. I think there's about 700 species. And one of these bacteria is E. coli. And we also have some other obligate anaerobes, which means they can live without oxygen. And these are naturally occurring in the large intestine. And I should say that E. coli only makes you sick when it crosses a barrier within the body. So that's why we can have E. coli in the colon without it making us sick. And the reason we have these bacteria in our colon is that they help to break down undigestible material and often produce essential vitamins. An example of such a vitamin would be B12. These bacteria also generate gas as they perform fermentation, and this is what actually leads to flatulence in the colon. Now we're going to go into more detail about the appendix, and I actually covered most of this a few slides ago, but we're going to talk about it a little bit again. The book says that the function of the appendix is unclear, though I would really just go ahead and say that the appendix doesn't really serve a function at this point. The book says it may play a role in the immune system. I suppose if it did, it would probably work like the Peyer's patches in the small intestine. Some scientists have suggested that it is a structure which at some point in our evolution was used to store the good bacteria which our bodies need along the length of the colon. So here they're just saying that it's an area for bacteria storage, even though I would say if this theory is indeed true, it would be used more like the cecum in a horse or something, or another hindgut fermenter. Don't worry about that, but that's just what we call those types of animals. Now appendicitis is inflammation of the appendix, and it can be recognized as pain near the belly button, which slowly migrates to the lower right side of the body. And this would be an example of referred pain because the appendix actually isn't in this area, it's somewhere else. However, we feel the pain in a different place, and that's referred pain. Other symptoms of appendicitis include nausea, vomiting, low fever, constipation or diarrhea, inability to pass gas, abdominal bloating, and pain when moving. And the reason the appendix might be inflamed is that feces may be blocking the entrance, or lymph nodes in the surrounding walls may be swollen due to infection. And like I said earlier, the appendix can be surgically removed to prevent it from rupturing and releasing pathogens such as those which cause gangrene into the intestine or the abdominal cavity. And since the appendix essentially doesn't have a function, people do just fine without it. Here's a chart which summarizes the functions of the various digestive organs we just covered. And I'm not going to go into this really, but just use this as a study aid for the test. It appears as though I forgot to tell you the technical term for the process of chewing, and this is called mastication because it's primarily performed with the masseter muscles in the mouth. Anyway, moving on. Section 15.4, digestion is both mechanical and chemical. And we talked about both of these a little bit already, but here they are again. Mechanical digestion is the chopping, cutting, and tearing of large pieces of food into smaller ones. And this also includes emulsification because we're breaking down the large fat droplets into smaller ones without doing anything to their chemical structure or otherwise altering it. And this is performed, or rather it's carried out, through the aid of bile from the gallbladder, which enters the duodenum of the small intestine. Now, unlike mechanical digestion, chemical digestion is where we actually alter the chemical bonds. So in chemical digestion, the digestive enzymes break down carbohydrates, lipids, or protein polymers into short chain units called monomers, and these are actually the single units of a polymer, or the singular molecules of the polymer. And like I've said before, enzymes are functional proteins that work best under a set of optimal conditions of pH, temperature, the concentration of substrate, and product levels. And we'll talk about this more in a second. The shorter units that we created are then absorbed in the small intestine and used to produce the proteins and energy that we need for survival. So this picture just shows how enzymes break down substrates into smaller parts. Or you could just say this is how enzymes break down polymers into monomers. So here at number 1, we have a large molecule of whatever nutrient being placed in the active site of that enzyme. And the active site is just the part of the enzyme where the substrate goes that actively breaks the bond of that substrate, or rather the bond between the molecules in that substrate. Anyway, once it's in the active site, in this case we add water, and through hydrolysis we break this substrate into two pieces, and we might break it down even further with other enzymes, but really what we want to accomplish in this process is just to cut down the polymer into single units so that we can absorb it in the small intestine. Here's a chart which lists the names of the enzymes, where they're found, the substrates they interact with, and the products they produce. And we're probably going to cover most of these actually, or at least the majority of these on a test. And a good rule of thumb is if I didn't mention it earlier on in this set of slides, then it's probably not going to be in the test. But if I did, then there's a pretty good chance it will be. Now we're at the final portion of chapter 15, and this is entitled Regulation of Our Digestive Activities is Based on Blood Sugar Levels. Now the sugar in blood is typically glucose, and it's kept at approximately 70 to 110 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood. And we need to maintain this blood sugar glucose level because it's essential to keep the neurons functioning, and that makes it essential for maintaining and carrying out all other body processes. So when these glucose blood levels drop, this is when we feel hungry. And if you're like me, this might also make you feel cranky. Now when we eat, the blood sugar levels rise from the absorption of ingested glucose. However, if we do not eat, we begin to break down glycogen stores. And this is, like I've said before, where excess glucose, or rather the form excess glucose, has been stored in the liver and skeletal muscles. Now the good thing about glycogen is we can break it down to glucose relatively quickly. However, fats and proteins can also be converted to glucose, but at a higher energy expense. And this is why you need to eat when you're hungry, because we don't want to start breaking down fats. Well, I mean, maybe we do want to start breaking down fats if you're trying to lose body fat, but we don't really want to be breaking down proteins because that's what our tissues are mostly made of. So during starvation, the protein of the skeletal muscle and sometimes even the heart muscle is broken down to provide glucose for the brain at whatever cost to these tissues, because the brain's our most important organ and we're going to make darn sure that it functions. Section 14.1, Nutrients are life-sustaining. And there are two main types of nutrients. There are the macronutrients, which we've covered quite a bit, and these include carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. These are what provide the necessary energy and materials for the body to create its own carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and we use all of these to create new cells. And then there are the micronutrients, which I've only covered a little bit, and these include vitamins and minerals. Both of these are required for proper functioning of essential compounds, such as those enzymes involved in cellular respiration, so they're obviously very important. As we've essentially already covered macronutrients, most of this will be review, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. But anyway, carbohydrates are our best source of energy. Diet has a major effect on body functions, and that's because our diet is what supplies the major nutrients, vitamins, and minerals that we need to carry out our physiological processes. Now, carbohydrate can be broken down into carbo, which means carbon, and hydrate, which means water, and that's mostly because they're made up of carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And there are several different kinds of complex carbohydrates, but our primary example of a complex carbohydrate is starch. And these carbohydrates can be converted to glucose, which is our body's chief energy source. And some of these complex carbohydrates, like cellulose or fiber, really benefit our digestive system. One, they can help to reduce the risk of colon cancer, and two, they help to ensure that our colon isn't full of feces, so they help just keep you cleaned out. And then there are simple sugars, which are low in fiber and high in empty calories, and I would say that it's best to get most of your carbohydrates in the form of complex carbohydrates. They're also high on the glycemic index for what it's worth. They provide a surge in blood glucose, which leads to increased insulin production and may eventually be converted to fat, such as triglycerides. And these types of sugars may have several health risks, which include a heightened risk of developing diabetes. Here's just some more real basic review of carbohydrates. They're composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The most common carbohydrate is glucose, and its chemical formula is right there, and it's in the picture over at your right. And our ability to digest carbohydrates is very efficient. Ingested glucose can be broken down completely into energy, carbon dioxide, and water, so that's pretty good. And we can use this ingested glucose to go and produce ATP, and also amino acids, glycogen, and triglycerides. But as it's our primary energy source, we don't typically use it to produce amino acids, glycogen, and triglycerides. This is just our simple sugars shaming slide, just because these carbohydrates can be harmful to our health. And refined sugars and fructose sweeteners are high in simple sugars, and they may contribute to obesity. And this is part of our Wiki 3 topic for this module. They can also lead to the pancreas secreting large amounts of insulin, leading to insulin resistance, which is seen in type 2 diabetes. And that's going to be the second topic of our wiki. And I'm actually just going to have questions over diabetes. The high fructose corn syrup portion of the wiki is going to be opinions. These simple sugars increase fat deposition, which may increase the risk of coronary heart disease, liver disease, and certain cancers. Lipids are another class of macronutrient. Like I've said before, fats are long chains of carbon molecules with more carbons and less oxygens than carbohydrates. And there are two basic kinds of lipids. There are saturated fats, where every space in the carbon chain is accompanied with hydrogens. These stay solid at room temperature due to their ability to line up with each other, and these types of fats are usually derived from animals. Then we have unsaturated fats, which have one or more double bonds in the carbon chain, and these come in two varieties. We have monounsaturated fat, where only one double bond is present. If the fat has more than one double bond, it's said to be polyunsaturated. And because the double bonds make kinks in the long carbon chains, unsaturated fats cannot pack together tightly and thus are liquid at room temperature. And these come from plant sources mostly, a primary example being vegetable oils. Here are some foods which contain a high level of saturated fats. So we have bacon, other meats, butter, milk, and cheese. Also, coconut milk is high in saturated fat. It kind of stinks that something like bacon tastes so good but is yet so bad for you. So here's an example of polyunsaturated fat, and this is found in what appears to be shed spread in this case. So up at the top we have one conformation of a polyunsaturated fat, and then at the bottom we have the other two conformations of the same fat. Here at your right are two more examples of foods which contain a type of polyunsaturated fat, and these include walnuts and canola oil. And as you can see, there are two double bonds in that fat. And then at the bottom left is an example of a monounsaturated fatty acid, which is oleic acid. And foods which contain monounsaturated fats are olive oil and sunflower seeds. Now, when I say that certain fats are bad, I'm not suggesting that you stop eating them by any means, because I'm not going to, but it might be a good idea to not eat so many of them. I mean, it's probably not a great idea to live on bacon alone. Now we're going to talk about another lipid-containing molecule, the lipoprotein. And these are our body's way of transporting fats in the blood. And this is because, like I've heavily suggested before, fats are not soluble in water because they're nonpolar while water's polar. And this makes them difficult to transport in our watery blood. So in order to transport them through the blood, we attach them to a protein called a lipoprotein. And these lipoproteins form into these balls or droplets where the lipids themselves are coated with proteins, phospholipids, and cholesterol. Now, like we said before, the phospholipid heads are polar at their phosphate end, which allows the molecules to be suspended in an aqueous or watery environment. And if I haven't said it before, the phospholipids are amphipathic, which means they have both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic end. And here you can see the two different types of lipoproteins. There's LDL and HDL, and we'll talk about these more in a second. Fats are necessary, but they can be harmful. And a good example of a fat that's necessary but can be harmful is cholesterol. And cholesterol is carried through the body in two forms: as low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, which is bad cholesterol typically. And these contain 25% protein, 20% phospholipids, 45% cholesterol, and 10% other lipids. And these lipoproteins carry most of the cholesterol in our blood, and they can deposit in the arteries, which leads to the formation of fatty plaques that can increase the risk of coronary artery disease, among some other conditions. Then there's high-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, which are usually called good cholesterol. They contain about 45% protein, 30% phospholipids, and only about 25% cholesterol and other lipids. So they contain quite a bit less cholesterol. And these help to remove excess cholesterol from the arterial wall and transport it to the liver for disposal or storage or use. And our body actually requires two types of fats, and these are called essential fats, and they're named alpha linolenic acid or omega-3 fatty acid, and linoleic acid or omega-6 fatty acid. And omega-3 fat is typically found in fish and may reduce the risk of cancer. Omega-6 is also good for you too. So here's a chart from your book which just has some tips on how to regulate the good and bad fats within your body. And I'm not really going to read these, but anyway, the chart has steps on how to limit your intake of cholesterol, trans fat, and saturated fat. Advice on how to increase your intake of polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. And it also tells you ways you can help increase your omega-3 fat intake. The last type of macronutrient is protein, and it's essential to our diet. And like I've said before, there are 20 different amino acids which are used to synthesize the proteins in our body. The body usually doesn't break down protein for energy, except in cases of starvation for the most part. Instead, we break down proteins into amino acids so that we can use them to make our own proteins to fulfill the various body functions. The book says that adults only need 60 milligrams of protein a day, and that's about 0.36 to 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Excess protein is passed from the body, and if you're like me, you're guilty of eating too much protein most of the time. Humans are capable of synthesizing 12 of the 20 amino acids, but they can't make the remaining 8. And these remaining 8 that we can't make are called essential amino acids, and we must obtain these from the food we eat. So in this chart, they've listed the essential amino acids and the non-essential amino acids. And your book shows that there are 9 essential amino acids, but we're going to keep it to 8. We're going to move histone over to a non-essential amino acid. And I'm not quite sure if the jury's out still on if histone is essential or non-essential, but we're just going to say it's non-essential. This chart shows the essential amino acids and which foods we can find them in. Now, if you eat meat, you're good for your essential amino acids because meats are complete proteins because they are a complete source of all essential amino acids. Now, if you don't eat meat, you're going to have to try a little harder to get your amino acids. So it's suggested that you have a diet of rice, corn, or other grains, along with lentils, soybeans, and other legumes like peanuts or something. And this would ensure that you get all of your amino acids. So just like the other two macronutrients, we also have a protein shaming slide. And the main problem with protein is that overabundance of protein typically results in dehydration. And we're going to lose the most water during exercise because we sweat. This overabundance of protein, which leads to dehydration, can then lead to calcium loss in the urine, which can then lead to kidney stones, which can be very painful to get rid of. I would suggest that if you eat a lot of protein, it's also a good idea to drink a lot of water. Red meat in particular is a good source of protein, but it's also high in saturated fats, which have been implicated in leading to cardiovascular disease. Now we're going to talk about the micronutrients, which are vitamins and minerals. Micronutrients are not broken down, but are instead used by the body intact. And this is because they're required for enzyme functioning and also for the synthesis of specific proteins. Vitamins are organic micronutrients, and of course they don't include proteins, fats, or carbohydrates. And these are used for metabolism, and they can be either water soluble, such that they dissolve in water, or fat soluble, where they dissolve in fats. Minerals are essentially just like vitamins, they're just inorganic. The major minerals make up components of cells, body fluids, and tissues, such as calcium, and these are found in quantities of more than 5 grams within the body. And then there's the minor minerals, which also, well, they're actually components of larger molecules, such as the iron and hemoglobin, and these are found in quantities of less than 5 grams in the body. Here's a chart which shows the fat-soluble vitamins. It lists their names, where they're found, what they're used for, and what conditions deficiency in these vitamins can cause. And these fat-soluble vitamins include A, D, E, and K, and it would probably be a good idea to be familiar with all of these vitamins, especially A, D, and E. Just know where they're found, more or less what we use them for, and it's probably a really good idea to be familiar with some of these deficiency conditions like night blindness, rickets, and osteomalacia. Here's a chart of the water-soluble vitamins, and we're not really going to go into these as much as the lipid-soluble vitamins, just because there's too many of them. But I would suggest being familiar with vitamin C at the very least, and B12 is probably a good one to know well because it's produced by the bacteria in the colon. As for the rest of them, I'm not sure I'm going to include much of them on the test, if I include them at all. Here's a chart showing the minerals, and this chart's pretty self-explanatory, but I'd be pretty familiar with calcium, iron, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, and sulfur, just because they're the common minerals found in living organisms. And it would probably also be a good idea to be familiar with, or at least fairly familiar with, magnesium. Here's the MyPlate dietary guidelines set forth by the government, and I'm not sure how much this MyPlate thing actually matters. They like to change around the food pyramid into other forms all the time, so maybe this one will stay around for a while, but it'll probably be eventually changed to something else, I would say. But anyway, from this plate, you can tell they want us to eat mostly plant material like fruits and vegetables and grains, and our plate needs to consist of less than 25% protein, which is a bummer. and more than 25% vegetables, less than 25% fruits, and maybe about 30% grains. And one problem I have with this is I'm not really sure how much dairy this corresponds to. So just take it as is, I guess. Section 14.2, nutrients are metabolized, or at least macronutrients are. Metabolism is the summation of all the chemical reactions which take place in the body, and it consists of two components: anabolism and catabolism. In anabolism, we combine these small molecules into more complex compounds, which consumes more energy than it produces, because we're trying to make complex compounds here, not break them down. And catabolism is the opposite, because here we break molecules down, which produces more energy than it consumes. Carbohydrate metabolism can release energy gradually. Most of the glucose in our bodies is actually catabolized or broken down to make ATP, which we could call our premier energy source. Glucose is also used in anabolism because it's a monomer which we can use to form glycogen, which is the only carbohydrate stored in the body and is stored in the liver and the skeletal muscles. Now, the process of creating glycogen is called glycogenesis, and it's made possible through the assistance of the insulin hormone. Now, during intense athletic events, you may exhaust your body's supply of glycogen, and this is the reason for the practice of carbo loading, where you eat a bunch of carbs before the event so that you can ensure that you won't exhaust your body's supply of carbohydrates. Good carbohydrates are typically those which include natural fiber, and foods high in fiber include any bread or baked good that is made from whole wheat, unprocessed grain, or rolled oats. This is because the processing these grains breaks down the fiber before we eat it. Other foods high in fiber are fruits and vegetables, which are typically high in fiber, I should say. And these fiber sources would include spinach, tomatoes, most fruit, and kidney beans, and I would say beans in general are a pretty good source of fiber. This diagram should be familiar to everyone because it shows the process of cellular respiration, which includes glycolysis, the Krebs or citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And just with the chapter where we covered it, know these three parts of cellular respiration and know what the final products are of each of these parts, and know what substances or chemicals, molecules that we're creating as a result of each of these three processes. So this slide's essentially a repeat of another slide from another set of slides. And here we just had the final products of cellular respiration. And this is just a really good way to memorize the products created from each part of cellular respiration. So aerobic cellular respiration, which is cellular respiration involving oxygen, can lead to the production of 32 ATP molecules in total. And this is 32 ATP molecules from one molecule of glucose. And this is the most efficient way to produce energy for multicellular organisms. And we can, of course, carry out fermentation, but we produce way less ATP from that. So from steps 1 and 2, we've created 10 NADH molecules and 2 FADH molecules, which enter the electron transport chain. And in the electron transport chain, we make 28 ATP molecules because we get 2.5 ATP molecules per NADH and 1.5 ATP molecules for FADH. And the final electron acceptor in this chain is oxygen, which produces H2O, So here are our final products from each of these parts of the cellular respiration are 2 ATP from glycolysis, 2 ATP from the citric acid cycle, and 28 ATP from the electron transport chain, resulting in 32 ATP per molecule of glucose. And don't trust the book on this because it says there are 36 ATPs produced per molecule of glucose, which is simply wrong because they rounded the numbers wrong. Lipids can provide another energy source for the body, and this is because they can be oxidized to produce ATP, which is carried out when the body is low on carbohydrates. So here we metabolize the fat stores and then convert the fats into small molecules called ketones. And these ketones are what is oxidized to produce ATP. Their concentration in the blood can rise above normal levels, and the body may enter a metabolic state called ketosis, which can happen when you haven't eaten for a while. And extreme ketosis can lead to acidosis, in which the pH of blood becomes very low or acidic. And acidosis can be serious because it can lead to coma or possibly death. In those who are diabetic, ketosis signifies them being critically low on insulin, so it would then be necessary to inject the insulin. Ketosis can also occur after going without food for a while, like I said. If you consume more calories than you need, the body converts the excess glucose into triglycerides, which are then stored in adipose tissue. And if I haven't said it before, the calorie is actually a measure of heat, and it measures how much heat it requires to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. And we'll talk more about calories in the following slides. Actually, I'm not sure if we're going to cover calories in much detail in this chapter just because the book doesn't say much about them. But anyway, like I said, a calorie is the amount of heat or energy required to raise the temperature of water, or 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. And the calories that you see on the back of foods on the labels, those are actually kilocalories, which are 1,000 calorie units. But anyway, on to the rest of these slides. Fad diets have mass appeal, but little or no long-term effect. And here are some trendy diet programs, or at least some diet programs which have been trendy in the past. There's the Mediterranean or Predican diet, which is a diet high in carbohydrates and fiber, which you get from whole grains and vegetables. There's the Atkins diet, which is a low carbohydrate and high protein and fat diet. And I can kind of see how that wouldn't work over the long term. Because if you just, if you don't eat carbohydrates, you begin to break down the proteins and fats in the body, which is probably a great way to get rid of fat, but it's also a great way to get rid of muscle mass. And then there's the Zone and South Beach diet, which is a low carbohydrate diet with a high protein and healthy fat consumption level. And so that is essentially the same as the Atkins diet. Sometimes people also use prescription drugs to lose weight, which I would only suggest in extreme circumstances. There are also surgical procedures, which I really would not suggest at all. There's stomach stapling or partitioning off a portion of the stomach. There's gastric bypass, where they attach the lower part of the small intestine to the stomach. There's gastric banding, where a constriction band is used to reduce stomach size. And then finally there's liposuction, which is simply the removal of fat cells. And this is best used for people who are a little overweight, but are not obese or morbidly obese. And the reason I say you should avoid a lot of these procedures, except maybe liposuction, is that it will just, well, it might mess you up physiologically or leave you with a permanent problem. So I would just say only use these in extreme cases. To maintain weight and energy homeostasis, energy input should equal energy output. In energy homeostasis, the body weight remains the same or constant as the amount of energy provided by the nutrients we take in is equal to the amount of energy we expend through exercise. When these two amounts don't match, you can either lose weight or gain weight. And just to illustrate how difficult it may be to lose a pound of fat, 1 pound of weight gain corresponds to 3,500 calories. So in order to burn off this many calories, you'd either have to not eat for 2 days or just exercise enough to expend all of those calories. Now, energy expenditure depends on our basal metabolic rate and the amount of physical activity and heat given off by the food being digested and stored, or the calories in food. And even though a calorie is really a measure of heat, it also determines how much substance is in food, and thereby will determine, or rather it will allow us to regulate our energy homeostasis when we monitor the amount of calories we take in. The amount of energy we expend can actually fluctuate dramatically. During heavy exercise, we may use as much as 15 times as much energy as we use when we're just resting. Typically, children expend more energy because of all the reactions in their bodies related to growth. Here's a chart which shows some types of food and the approximate calorie counts in each of these, and also has a column which has exercise suggestions to burn off these calories gained from each of these foods. And you can just look at this for just the reference material related to maintaining energy homeostasis. Section 14.3, Health can be hurt by nutritional disorders. This is the last section that we're going to cover here. So, attitudes about body weight are often cultural. Some cultures encourage a higher body weight and some discourage it. However, excess weight raises, or rather causes, important health issues. And one of these issues that we're seeing in the United States is obesity, which is caused through a combination of genetics and sedentary lifestyle, or just sitting around, and also the larger portions of food available, or just people eating more. And we can figure out if someone is obese by looking at the body mass index, or BMI, where we compare our height to our weight, and this is typically used as an indicator of weight-related health risk. Like I said before, we use the kilocalorie to measure the amount of energy or substance provided by a food, and the more calories you eat, the higher your tendency to gain weight unless you exercise to burn these calories. Now, the basal metabolic rate, or BMR, is the amount of energy your body needs. And this is typically higher in younger individuals or children, and it's typically higher in men than women. Here's a chart of the body mass index. And in this chart, you just look at your height, and then you find your approximate weight. And when you move your finger across where your height is to where your approximate weight is, you get your BMI. Now on this chart, a BMI in the blue squares means that an individual is underweight. If it's in the red squares, then an individual has a healthy weight. If it's in green, that individual would be overweight. And if it's in yellow, the individual is obese. And before you start freaking out about your BMI, know this. it doesn't really incorporate muscle mass into the BMI. So if you are in sports or work out a lot, this chart might say you have a high BMI, but that's simply because muscle weighs more than fat, so this would cause your BMI to go up. But actually, I would say having a slightly higher muscle mass, or even a fairly high muscle mass, isn't a bad thing. Here are some common eating disorders, or at least the first three of them are common eating disorders. So the one we typically hear the most about these days is anorexia nervosa, which is actually a psychological disorder because it's essentially the fear of getting fat. And this results in self-induced starvation, high physical activity, and may include purging. So this is a pretty rough eating disorder. There's bulimia nervosa, where an individual eats large amounts of high-calorie food, which is called binge eating, and this is followed by purging to avoid gaining weight. And purging in the case of these eating disorders simply means to vomit up the food before you have a chance to digest it completely. And then there's binge eating disorder, which is a little bit more talked about these days than it was in the past because of the percentage of overweight adults in America, I suppose. And this is a disorder which occurs in obese people, and this is overeating not followed by purging. And this disorder can lead to depression, anger, and anxiety, which leads to even more binges, such that it's just a never-ending cycle. And then finally is a disorder that we really don't talk about much because it's muscle dysmorphia. And this is where people think their bodies are underdeveloped. And this is typically a disorder of bodybuilders. And they think that their bodies are so underdeveloped that they become preoccupied with bodybuilding activities and diet. Food is life-sustaining, but sometimes it can also be life-threatening. And here we're going to talk about the three common types of bacteria that can cause food poisoning when ingested. And these are Campylobacter, Salmonella, and E. coli. Campylobacter is a bacteria typically found in the intestines of fowls such as chickens and turkeys. And it's typically ingested by eating undercooked poultry, and a symptom typically caused by ingesting Campylobacter is diarrhea. Then there's Salmonella, which is also found in the intestines of birds and also reptiles and mammals. And this displays typical food poisoning symptoms, so either diarrhea or vomiting usually. It may enter the bloodstream, which leads to a condition called septicemia, which can be life-threatening just because we don't really want bacteria in our blood. And then there's E. coli, which is typically present in the colon of cattle, pigs, and humans. Meat can be contaminated by these intestine contents over the process of slaughtering the animal. Ground beef is typically the worst culprit just because it's ground up, which means that there can be E. coli throughout the beef. And so this must be properly cooked to kill the E. coli. Vegetables can also be contaminated when washed with unsterilized water. And I'm going to say this about beef. Typically the inside of meats like a steak is safe because they don't grind it up. So that just means if you can cook both sides of a steak, you really shouldn't expect to get sick, even though I wouldn't always say it's a good idea to eat a rare steak just because it can cause other problems such as CVD problems. Food shortages can cause other nutrition-related problems. So malnutrition, or simply bad nutrients, is a condition caused by inadequate diet. And this can either be a diet lacking in calories, a diet low in specific vitamins and minerals, and can also be due to infections, which cause vomiting, or diarrhea, which cause you to lose the previously ingested nutrients. So I should say that malnutrition can actually occur in an otherwise well-fed person just because they're not getting enough vitamins and minerals. And typically, malnutrition is associated with developing countries, and in these countries, it accounts for many deaths, especially of infants and the elderly, and it can also lead to substantially lower intelligence in those who survive. So that completes this module's slides, and I believe in the next set of slides we should have way fewer slides, so that's good.